Item cards can be used as many times per turn as you want, so have a generally lower power level than other types of cards with more restrictions. Even so, there are some that go a little too far in niche use and usability. So starting us off at number 10, we have Nemona's Backpack. This item card allows you to recover 2 Nemona cards from your discard pile. This card is an excellent example of what makes an item card bad, being both highly situational and low impact. Generally speaking, the most popular items in the Pokemon TCG are ones that help set up Pokemon in play. These cards with no limits to how often they can be used within a turn are important to the game's balance, because they allow players to establish a board state that they need to begin to try to win the game with. If you can't get whatever Pokemon your deck is built around into play, you'd stand no chance at victory. The other most important item cards are those which provide important utility effects, such as counter Catcher's ability to switch your opponent's active Pokemon, or Rescue Stretcher's ability to recover important Pokemon from your discard pile. Nemona's Backpack is an item which falls into an awkward middle ground between these two categories. Because its effect adds cards from your discard pile to your hand, it's not useful on the first few turns of the game. However, the effect it provides isn't useful enough to be a powerful ability options in decks. Nemona is a supporter card that has the simple effect of drawing 3 cards. In the Pokemon TCG, supporter cards with this exact effect are considered very low power and meant for beginners because there are much better cards to use your single supporter per turn on. If you want to play Nemona's Backpack, the deck you'd be using the card in needs to play a large amount of Nemona, and would ideally want to play Nemona as often as possible to maximize the value from the backpack. While a deck like Tinkaton EX could benefit from using a draw 3 supporter every turn, there exist many better options for draw power. With how many better supporters exist, and how many better ways there are to draw cards, there's no reason to use Nemona's Backpack, and so it's fitting to start off this list. And at number 9, we have Super Energy Removal 2. This card, although not labeled an item card, it would be considered one now because the item tag did not exist in the TCG yet at this time. In fact, this card is from the e-reader era, the first 3 sets of the Pokemon TCG to create a distinction between item and supporter cards. Before this block of sets, all trainer cards had no restrictions, leading to a lot of unbalance with extremely strong effects having no limits. Super Energy Removal 2 is a heavily nerfed version of the iconic and format warping Super Energy Removal card from the Game Space set. When you play Super Energy Removal 2, you flip 2 coins. If both are heads, you discard all energy cards attached to your opponent's active Pokemon. However, if both are tails, you discard all energy attack to your active Pokemon. Also, if you flip 1 heads and 1 tails, the item does nothing. Energy disruption cards have been a key part of many control decks whenever that archetype is meta relevant. Items such as Crushing Hammer or Enhanced Hammer are always a consideration when building a slower paced deck due to how strong removing an opponent's energy cards with items can be. On paper, Super Energy Removal 2 could fulfill a similar role in these decks, but its inflexibility and reliance on coin flip effects with additional downsides for failing prevented it from being competitively viable during its time in the standard format. Firstly, unlike both hammers and the original energy removal cards, Super Energy Removal 2 cannot discard energy from an opponent's bench Pokemon. This allows the opponent to set up energy on their bench, keeping it safe from being discarded. Secondly, on average, if you play 4 Super Energy Removals 2 throughout a game, only one of them will actually discard the energy from your opponent's Pokemon. Also, when doing so, you'll likely be at some point forced to discard the energy from your active Pokemon. Energy disruption via item cards doesn't have to be the most reliable, as evident by the coin flipping dependent Crushing Hammer being frequently meta relevant, but you'd ideally want a card you'd play 4 of to function more than once per game. Speaking of 4 of items that only work once, we have Missing Clover. This card has 2 effects. One when you play a single copy of the card, and one more powerful effect if you play 4 of the cards from your hand at once. If you play a single Missing Clover, you may look at the top card of your deck. If you play 4, you get to take 1 prize card. Any means that allows a player to take a prize card without having to knock out an opponent's Pokemon can be incredibly powerful, and players frequently try to leverage these effects whenever possible to help win games. Kartana GX and Nargonautl and Guzzlord Tag Team GX were played in many different decks during the Sun and Moon era of the TCG because their once per game GX attacks took 1 and 2 prize cards respectively without being reliant on damage. Even the 3-card combo of Jirachi Prism Star paired with Detective Pikachu movie promo Mr. Mime and Oranguru found its way into many different archetypes because it allowed the players to draw an extra prize card when they took Jirachi Prism Star from their prizes. Missing Clover exists in a similar space as the Jirachi Prism Star combo, requiring multiple cards to set up the very powerful effect of taking an extra prize card. However, the item card is simply not strong enough to have been worthwhile in any competitive standard format deck. The main reason for this card's lack of playability was the difficulty that came from assembling 4 copies of Missing Clover in your hand at the same time. There are very few ways to search specific item cards from the deck during the card's time in the standard format, and even fewer ways to recover any discarded items if one of your 4 Clovers somehow got into your discard pile. Similarly, if you prized a single copy of Missing Clover, you wouldn't be able to use the effect to take a prize card, instead being limited to the near useless effect of looking at the top card of your deck. Compared to a combo made up entirely of highly searchable Pokemon, and it's clear why Missing Clover never made a competitive splash. And at number 7, we have Return Label, a rare case of discard pile disruption in the Pokemon TCG. This item lets you choose any card in your opponent's discard pile and shuffle it back into your opponent's deck. Lots of cards or archetypes across the game's history have used the discard pile to some kind of benefit. Decks built around Pokemon that can attach energy from the discard pile, such as Malamar or Electric, and most recently Gardevoir EX, have been consistent figures in any standard format they've been allowed in. Archetypes like Cerula GX or Night March gain increased damage based on how many cards of a certain type are in the discard pile. The discard pile is even important in slower paced or controlling archetypes, with reusing supporter cards like Silene or Lusamine being key to maintaining a lock against an opponent. As a result, whenever there have been cards good against discard pile reliant decks, they've seen competitive play. Girafaridge's attack permanently removed any 2 cards from your opponent's discard pile from the game, becoming a key card against control decks by disrupting Lusamine loops. Karen's ability to shuffle all Pokemon from each player's discard pile into their decks acted as a failsafe against Night March decks in Standard, and Regidrago V-Star decks in Expanded. Clearly, taking cards out of the discard pile has been a meta-game relevant effect. So why is Return Label on this list? Return Label suffers from a problem many other utility items with niche effects also suffer from. Their effect is too low impact to actually fulfill its intended role. Returning a single card from opponent's discard pile to the deck doesn't meaningfully interact with any discard-reliant strategies. Girafaridge was powerful because the cards it put into the Lost Zone were permanently removed, thus not being recoverable by Lusamine. Return Label shuffling a supporter card your opponent wants looped into their deck doesn't impact their game plan because that resource is now back into their deck to be reused. Likewise, Karen's strength came from the amount of cards it returned. Against a Night March deck, all shuffling a single Pokemon into the deck does is reduce the archetype's namesake attack by 20 damage. Getting that single card back into the discard pile is also not particularly difficult. As a result, Return Label fails to fulfill its intended niche. And at number 6, we have Max Revive, one of the worst Pokemon recovery items in the game's history. Over the course of a game, many Pokemon cards will get put into your discard pile. Pokemon you need may get knocked out, discarded by a card effect, or milled by your opponent. As a result, cards which allow players to efficiently recycle a discarded Pokemon become so prevalent in decks that it's common to see them found in almost every player's deck lists in the top cut of a large event. Items such as Rescue Stretcher gave players the choice of putting a single Pokemon into the hand for immediate value, or shuffling 3 Pokemon into the deck to gain value from these cards later. Night Stretchers changes the choice from adding or shuffling Pokemon to adding a Pokemon or energy card from deck to hand, trading off the future value recycling more Pokemon for a chance to add back energy cards in a situation where you may be otherwise unable to attack. Mixing these 2 different stretcher cards together, there's also Super Rod, which allows players to shuffle 3 of any combination of Pokemon or basic energy cards from the discard pile back into their deck to be used later. When you look at all of these cards, it becomes pretty obvious that Max Revive is in most cases wholly inferior. The previous 3 cards either recycle more cards or provide more immediate value. The only upside Max Revive has to Super Rod is that Pokemon you choose gets put on top of the deck instead of shuffled, allowing you to draw it immediately off of a card like Electrode. Even so, you'd still have to jump through hoops to do half of what Night Stretcher can do. As a result, Max Revive is a wholly outclassed and outright bad item card. And at number 5, we have Quad Stone. This item functions similarly to the previously discussed Missing Clover, having a weak effect when played individually and a powerful effect when all 4 copies are played at the same time. When you play one, you can heal 10 damage from your active Pokemon. When all 4 are used at once, You instead heal all damage from all of your Pokemon. Much like missing Clover, Quad Stone suffers from its individually played effect being extremely underpowered, while also having a more situational effect when all 4 are played at once. As previously stated, getting all 4 copies of these cards in your hand at once is extremely difficult, and may often just come down to luck. With missing Clover, the timing of when you played it didn't matter, because drawing 1 prize card would be good no matter the circumstances, directly moving you closer to winning. However, to gain a significant benefit from the 4 played effect of Quad Stone requires damage to be spread across your board. If you run into a matchup where your opponent could simply one-shot your Pokemon, Quad Stone's intended powerful effect is useless. Not to mention, in these same cases, healing a single damage from your active Pokemon was abysmal. Turns out, a potion, a card which has seen almost no competitive usage despite being legal in every standard format the game has had, that heals less and can only be used on your active Pokemon, isn't very helpful. And at number 4, we have Tormenting Spray, a hand disruption item card. When played, your opponent randomly reveals a card from their hand. The earliest days of the Pokemon TCG were dominated by hand disruption cards that had no drawback, like the Rocket's Trap and Rocket Sneak Attack. As a result, the designers of the TCG tend to not put powerful hand disruption effects on item cards. As a result, item-based hand disruption, whenever present in the standard format, has a long history of being powerful in the Pokemon TCG. Red Card and Reset Stamp were metagame staples during the X and Y and Late Sun and Moon blocks respectively. Even more niche effects like Grabber, Hand Trimmer, and Peeking Red Card have enjoyed top-level competitive experimentation. Unfortunately for Tormenting Spray, the card has one problem barring it from competitive success: its randomness. Looking at an opponent's hand and removing a supporter card of choice from it with an item card would have been far too powerful, not to mention extremely frustrating. In order to make an effect like this printable on a card without destroying the TCG's balance, Tormenting Spray needed to be random. However, that puts the card in a spot where it feels extremely bad to play and is most likely to do nothing. Firstly, it requires an opponent to have a supporter card in their hand to actually shuffle back with its effect. That's not unlikely, but what is rare is the odds of actually shuffling that card into the deck. The more cards your opponent has in their hand, the less likely Tormenting Spray will discard a supporter that you want to interact with. Meanwhile, if your opponent's hand has a lot of supporter cards, making Tormenting Spray more likely to shuffle a card back, it may not matter, since your opponent will still have additional supporters to use anyway. As a result, this card just doesn't fulfill its intended role. And at number 3, we have Expedition Uniform, a near useless item card. This card lets you look at the bottom 3 cards of your deck and put them on top of your deck. There's actually quite a few different item cards that allow players to rearrange the top cards of the deck without providing any other effect, and all of them are equally as bad as this card. So think of Expedition Uniform's spot on this list as representing these similarly terrible cards. Now, the main issue facing all of these cards is that they provide no real immediate value. Why rearrange your deck when an item card like Acrobike, Trainer's Mail, or Trekking Shoes can instead draw you cards? Well, surprisingly, there have been archetypes in standard formats that could gain some use from having their deck stacked. Colossal's VMAX attack dealt bonus damage and accelerated energy to itself if you discarded a fighting energy from the top of your deck. Kyurem VMAX Glaciated World ability let you discard the top card of your deck and attach it to Kyurem if it was a water energy. Most recently, Slowking's Seek Inspiration attack allows it to copy an attack from a Pokemon you discard from the top of your deck, letting you avoid the prohibitive cost of high-powered attacks. But even with all of these different decks which could benefit from deck stacking, Expedition Uniform and its likewise cards have seen no competitive usage because all of these archetypes have had better ways to guarantee an important card on top of the deck. Colossal decks use Magcargo and Oranguru because they were Pokemon whose abilities could be used every turn. Kyurem also played Oranguru for similar reasons. Meanwhile, Slowking decks at present use Academy at Night because the Stadium card can be used multiple times over the course of a game. A one-time use effect to rearrange the deck's order simply isn't worthwhile when decks that would care about such an effect have way better ways to do so. And at number 2, we have Tropical Wind, a World Championship promo card. This card lets you flip a coin. If you win the flip, you heal 20 damage from both players' active Pokemon. If you lose the flip, both active Pokemon are instead put to sleep. A Pokemon that's asleep can't attack or retreat. In between turns, any player whose Pokemon is asleep flips a coin, and if they win, the Pokemon is no longer asleep. When you compare this card to something like Potion, it becomes pretty clear that Tropical Wind was made intentionally bad. Potion heals equal damage from any of your Pokemon without providing a benefit to your opponent, or being reliant on a coin flip. Due to the card's intended scarcity, Tropical Wind was intentionally nerfed to be a bad, albeit very flavorful card. Healing damage or putting Pokemon to sleep is very thematic for a tropical, relaxing setting that this item card shows, but it does nothing to help its competitive viability. If you were going to try and use Tropical Wind in a deck, it would be for its ability to put your opposing Pokemon to sleep, but that's not reliable enough to build a strategy around. Firstly, you'd still have to flip tails on the initial coin toss, then switch your now sleeping active Pokemon for a card which could attack. And then your opponent must fail the coin toss for waking up their active Pokemon. As a result, Tropical Wind just isn't a good card, like many other promotional cards. However, there's one other item card weaker than this one. And rounding out the list at number 1, we have Full Heal. This card has one simple, easy to understand, near worthless effect. When you play this card, you remove all status conditions from your active Pokemon. Status conditions like poison, burn, sleep, or paralysis are parts of the game that are oftentimes not particularly relevant. Very few decks across the TCG's history have made conditions like sleep or paralysis key parts of their game plan. A Pokemon like Articuno or Zekrom can prevent your opponent's active Pokemon from attacking or retreating every turn thanks to constantly paralyzing it. But when these decks enter the meta, Full Heal isn't the card that rises in usage to counter them. The main issue with Full Heal is that it competes as a good card against status condition based strategies with some of the best utility cards in the game due to how status conditions function in the Pokemon TCG. Built into the rules of the game are a variety of ways to cure status conditions, the most important of which being when a Pokemon goes from the active spot to the bench, all special conditions are removed from it. As a result, if a deck looking to steal wins from opponents using sleep or paralysis rises to prominence, players start using cards like Switch or Escape Rope to beat it. These two cards and their ability to swap your active Pokemon provide excellent utility regardless of what matchup you play against. Getting to avoid paying a Pokemon's retreat cost can help preserve energy on your board, or swap a Pokemon with no energy out of the active spot will be helpful in any match. Meanwhile, even if your opponent is using status conditions as part of their core strategy, Full Heal might not even matter. The more common status condition of Poison and Burn both inflict damage in between turns. A Poison Pokemon takes 10 damage between turns, whereas a Burn Pokemon takes 20 damage and can then be cured by winning a coin flip. On paper, these two status conditions can rack up a lot of damage if a Pokemon afflicted by them remains in the active spot. However, this is rarely how these two conditions are used in practice. In reality, cards which inflict poison or burn are often used more to help certain Pokemon take one-hit KOs they otherwise couldn't secure. As an example, in the current standard format, Brute Bonnet's Toxic Powder combined with Peerless Jungle and Binding Mochi are often paired with Archaludon EX to boost its 220 base damage to 290 damage, allowing it to KO Stage 1 Pokemon EX like Toedscruel or In's Zoroark EX. There will be no status conditions to cure with Full Heal if your poison Pokemon gets one-hit KO'd. Not to mention, these decks have reusable ways to inflict their status conditions of choice. Even if you cure a poison Pokemon, Brute Bonnet would just poison it again. As a result, Full Heal just isn't helpful. Full Heal is intended to be used against strategies that rely on their status conditions to win the game. However, the damage-based status conditions of Poison and Burn rarely remain on an active Pokemon due to said Pokemon getting knocked out, and the stall-based conditions of Sleep and Paralysis are better answered by more versatile cards. For so thoroughly failing to fulfill a single intended niche, Full Heal is easily the worst item card in the Pokemon TCG.